The airport was alive with its usual chaos. Rolling suitcases rattled over the tiled floors, announcements echoed from every direction, and hurried travelers brushed past one another in a constant blur. Amid the clamor, David felt like an island of anxiety, carrying not only his luggage but the weight of a responsibility far heavier than any briefcase. In his arms, 6-month-old Liam squirmed violently, his tiny fists clenching as though fighting an invisible enemy. The baby's cries pierced the hum of the busy terminal like a siren. David shifted his grip, trying to soothe him with a gentle bounce, but Liam's wails only grew louder. "Not now, please, not now," David whispered under his breath, his own panic rising. He glanced at the line of passengers waiting to board, aware of the impatient stares that were slowly starting to pierce through his flustered haze. There was the elderly woman with a tight-lipped frown, the businessman tapping his foot in irritation, the teenager rolling her eyes while scrolling on her phone. Each glance felt like a judgment, a silent accusation that he was failing in his most basic duty, calming his child. David's life had always been busy, chaotic even, but it had never been this humbling. Since the sudden death of his wife 2 years ago, every plane trip, every public outing, and every sleepless night had become a test of endurance and resilience. He had learned to function on little sleep, on half-digested meals, and on an endless supply of determination. But today, all of that training seemed to have deserted him. He shifted Liam to the other arm, hoping the change in position would ease his discomfort. Nothing worked. Liam's cries pierced through the air again, louder this time, like a sharp reminder that David was utterly powerless in this moment. "Sorry, I'm sorry," he muttered to the passengers nearby, who now were looking more annoyed than sympathetic. David could feel his face burning with embarrassment, and he hated it. More than the embarrassment, he hated the helplessness. He had been prepared for anything, diapers, bottles, burp cloths, but he hadn't been prepared for this. The unrelenting, piercing sound of his son's distress. He walked toward the boarding gate, praying that once on the plane, some miracle would occur. Maybe the hum of the engines, the dim lights, the sway of the cabin would soothe Liam. But even as he imagined that small hope, reality struck him with brutal force. Babies rarely followed schedules, rules, or logic, and Liam was a perfect example. The flight attendant, a tall woman with a professional smile, approached him with a clipboard. "Sir, are you ready to board?" she asked, her voice polite but tinged with the practiced patience of someone used to handling difficult situations. David nodded, though his mind was far from calm. Yes, we're ready," he stammered, adjusting Liam again. "Would you like any assistance?" she asked, glancing at the screaming baby. David shook his head quickly. "No, I've got it," he said, though the lie tasted bitter. He wasn't sure he did have it. As he stepped onto the plane, the tight aisle immediately added to the sense of claustrophobia. Every step felt like navigating a gauntlet, with passengers, knees, elbows, and carry-on bags threatening to collide with him at every turn. Liam's cries now filled the cabin, bouncing off the walls and overhead bins, attracting curious, and not always kind, glances from the seated passengers. David forced a smile at a young woman across the aisle. "Sorry," he whispered, hoping his tone conveyed both apology and desperation. She nodded politely but returned to her phone, as if acknowledging his predicament without really offering sympathy. Finally, David reached his seat, a cramped corner by the window, and struggled to wedge himself and Liam into the tight space. The seatbelt clicked into place, restraining him in a way that felt absurdly symbolic. He was strapped in, yet utterly incapable of restraining the storm of cries in his arms. He pulled out the bottle he had prepped, warmed to the exact temperature recommended by the pediatrician. Liam barely glanced at it, wriggling and turning his head as if rejecting the very idea of nourishment. David's fingers trembled as he tried to guide the bottle toward the baby's lips. Liam pushed it away with a tiny hand, then burst into a fresh round of screaming. The passengers around him sighed audibly. Some exchanged quick, judgmental glances. David could feel the eyes on him like heat. He swallowed hard, fighting to keep his composure. "Just a little longer, just a little longer," he whispered, rocking Liam gently in rhythm with the plane's vibrations. David's mind raced, pulling him back to memories of simpler days when he and his wife had traveled together. She had been the calm one, the patient one. She could soothe Liam with just a hum or a soft touch. Now, without her, every flight felt like a battle with no strategy, no ally, and no guaranteed victory. A nearby toddler suddenly started whining, joining Liam in a chorus of chaos. David's heart sank further. He felt like he was failing not just his child, but the world around him. Parents looked on with mild pity, non-parents with thinly veiled annoyance. The flight attendants did what they could, offering water and sympathetic smiles, but their interventions were minimal. They were trained to handle emergencies, not heartbreak. David tried switching Liam to a diaper change, thinking the discomfort might be the cause. He unbuckled himself, lifted the baby onto the small changing table, and quickly went through the motions. But Liam's cries didn't fade. They intensified. The small confined space of the airplane bathroom made the task even harder, and David realized, not for the first time, how unprepared he truly was for moments like these. By the time he returned to his seat, Liam's little face was red, tears streaming down his cheeks. David's shoulders sagged under the weight of exhaustion and shame. He muttered a prayer under his breath, though it felt more like a plea for survival than a spiritual invocation. Please, please just let him calm down. He tried singing, a soft tune he barely remembered from his own childhood. His voice cracked, unpracticed and shaky, but he persisted, hoping that familiarity might comfort Liam. The baby's cries softened momentarily but returned with vengeance, as if mocking his efforts. David felt trapped in a nightmare with no exit. The hum of the engines, the chatter of passengers, and the occasional clatter of service carts created a strange, surreal soundtrack to his torment. He imagined himself in headlines: "Single dad loses control on flight with infant." The thought made him grit his teeth, fighting the rising panic. In that moment, David realized that this flight was more than just a physical journey. It was a test of endurance, patience, and vulnerability. Every nerve in his body screamed in protest, but he knew he had no choice but to endure. For Liam, he had to keep trying. He adjusted the baby again, whispering softly in the way only a desperate parent can. "It's okay, Daddy's here, we're almost there." His words were a fragile bridge between hope and despair. Liam's cries, though relentless, seemed to carry a note of recognition, a tiny acknowledgement that he was not entirely alone. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, David took a deep breath. The engines roared to life, shaking the cabin slightly, and something in the rhythm of the vibration seemed to synchronize with the baby's heartbeat. David held on, both literally and figuratively, and braced himself for the climb, for the turbulence, and for the next hours that would test every ounce of his strength. This was just the beginning. Chapter 2. The plane had leveled off, its engines humming a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm that usually lulled passengers into a sense of calm. But for David, there was no calm, no sense of peace. Liam's wails had become a constant, piercing soundtrack, bouncing off the cabin walls and rattling the nerves of everyone in the immediate vicinity. David felt trapped, a man shackled by helplessness in a metal tube thousands of feet above the ground. He tried everything he knew: rocking, shushing, burping, singing. He had exhausted the arsenal of tips he had found online, every parenting forum suggestion he had ever bookmarked. Nothing worked. Liam's cries were now a shrill, unyielding crescendo, cutting through the ambient noise of the flight like a siren. David's own throat ached from shouting, whispering, and attempting to calm his son, his voice hoarse and trembling. Exhaustion weighed on him like lead. His arms were sore, his back ached from hours of awkward bending and holding, and the tight airplane seat seemed designed to amplify every ache and discomfort. Sweat had dampened the collar of his shirt, sticking uncomfortably to his skin, and his hands shook from the sheer adrenaline of stress. It was then that he noticed her. Across the aisle, a woman had been quietly observing him for some time. She was seated with the ease of someone who had traveled many times, her posture relaxed, yet her eyes held a sharp, perceptive kindness. She was Emily, though David didn't know it yet, and in her gaze, he felt, for the first time that flight, a glimmer of hope. Emily's hands rested calmly on her lap, but there was a readiness in the way she leaned slightly forward, a subtle signal that she was aware of the crisis unfolding just a few feet away. She noticed the tension in David's shoulders, the way his grip on Liam was almost panicked, and the subtle tremor in his fingers as he tried to soothe the crying baby. She had seen this before, though in far different contexts, of course, but she understood the helplessness that a parent feels when nothing seems to work. "Excuse me," she said softly, leaning toward him, careful not to startle the baby further. "Can I try something?" David blinked, uncertain. Who was this stranger, and how could she possibly help? His instinct was to decline, he had to handle this himself, but he was too tired, too desperate. He nodded, almost automatically. "Okay, please, I'll try anything," he said, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the storm of emotion within him. Emily reached into her carry-on bag with deliberate calm, pulling out a small, colorful toy that jingled gently when shaken. It was nothing extravagant, a plush duck with tiny bells inside, but it held promise. She sat upright in her seat and carefully held the toy so that it caught Liam's attention. "Hey there, little one," she cooed softly. "Look what I've got. Isn't it fun?" At first, Liam barely reacted. His cries continued, though now punctuated by little pauses as his eyes darted toward the movement. Emily didn't rush. She waved the toy gently, rotating it in a slow, rhythmic motion, her voice maintaining a soft, melodic cadence. David watched in amazement as something miraculous began to unfold. Liam's cries softened, slowing into intermittent whimpers. His fists unclenched slightly, and his tiny brows relaxed as if the sound and motion in front of him had created a bridge between panic and curiosity. "See, it's just a little toy," Emily whispered, smiling. "Nothing scary, just fun." David felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized how tense he had been until he saw the tiny smile beginning to form on Liam's tear-streaked face. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The drone of the engines, the chatter of passengers, the small clinks of service carts, they all faded into the background. All that existed was this small, fragile connection, a baby, a desperate father, and a stranger who had extended a hand when it mattered most. Liam's cries had almost completely stopped now. He reached out, fingers trembling, toward the toy. Emily handed it to him, letting him explore it with tiny, curious hands. The jingling sound, the bright colors, and the gentle sway seemed to soothe him in a way David had been unable to accomplish despite hours of effort. "Thank you," David whispered, his voice choked with relief and gratitude. I didn't know what else to do." Emily smiled, her eyes warm and understanding. "Parenting isn't a solo flight," she said softly. "Sometimes, you just need a little help." It was such a simple statement, yet it carried immense weight. David realized how much he had been carrying alone, not just Liam, but the fear of judgment, the stress of expectation, and the invisible pressure of appearing competent at all times. For a brief moment, the shame and panic that had gripped him seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile, yet comforting, sense of connection. As the flight continued, David found himself talking to Emily, not in the loud, frantic bursts of desperation that had characterized the previous hour, but in measured, quieter tones. He shared brief snippets of his life, how he had lost his wife, how he managed the challenges of solo parenting, how flights like this one felt like miniature crises. Emily listened, nodding empathetically, offering small smiles, and occasionally cooing to Liam when he seemed to need it. Passengers began to notice the shift. What had been a scene of tension and irritation transformed into something softer, almost heartwarming. A few even smiled discreetly, recognizing the power of empathy and small gestures in moments of shared humanity. David felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. He had been exposed in a way he had always feared, his vulnerability laid bare, but it had led to a connection he had not anticipated. Hours passed with gradual ease. Liam played with the toy Emily had introduced, occasionally glancing up at her with a curious fascination. David marveled at the transformation, the small miracle that had turned a nightmare into a manageable, even peaceful, journey. At one point, Liam, now calm and engaged, reached out to David, who scooped him into his arms with renewed confidence. He whispered softly to his son, "See, Daddy's got you. We're okay now." For the first time that day, those words felt true. Emily returned to her seat, but the quiet connection remained. She didn't need to be constantly involved. Her presence had already altered the dynamic, shifted the energy in the cabin, and given David the relief he had been seeking. It was a subtle, almost magical act, the power of intervention, empathy, and human kindness in the midst of desperation. As the flight neared its destination, David found himself reflecting on what had just occurred. He realized that no one truly manages life entirely alone. Every parent, every person, at some point needs a helping hand, a comforting word, or simply a presence that reminds them they are not alone. Emily had been that presence, a stranger who became a guardian angel when it mattered most. The plane began its descent, and David looked out the window at the shrinking clouds, feeling a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and profound gratitude. Liam, now asleep in his arms, looked peaceful and serene. The journey had begun in chaos, but it was ending with connection, empathy, and hope. David glanced at Emily one last time as the plane touched down smoothly on the runway. She smiled gently, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond forged in the skies. He wanted to thank her properly, to tell her how much her simple act of kindness had meant, but words felt inadequate. A nod, a heartfelt smile, a silent recognition, sometimes that was enough. As passengers disembarked, David carefully lifted Liam from the seat, holding him close. The plane was no longer a battleground, but a vessel that had carried him through despair, guided by the unexpected kindness of a stranger. He stepped into the airport with renewed hope, a lighter heart, and a deep understanding that even in moments of desperation, there are angels in human form, often appearing when we least expect them, yet exactly when we need them most. Narrator. In the end, it wasn't the comfort of the plane, the passing hours, or even the techniques David had tried that brought relief. It was a simple, unexpected act of empathy, a reminder that none of us are truly alone. That day, in the middle of the sky, a single father learned a lesson that would stay with him forever. Kindness has the power to heal, to calm, and to restore hope, even in the most desperate of moments. And sometimes, the smallest acts of compassion are the ones that change everything.